the larger conclusion that we've had is that there's been a long-term erosion to public access to government, and it's kind of reached a tipping point. And when we studied what's causing this, the very first thing we call out is the state legislature.
That's Mike Fancher, retired Seattle Times executive editor and currently the president of the Washington Coalition for Open Government. Welcome, everybody, to Chino Y Chicano.
I'm Matt Chan, the Chino.
I'm Enrique Serna, the Chicano. The Coalition is an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that works through the courts and the legislature to defend and strengthen Washington's open government laws. The watchdog group released a report recently that is highly critical of Washington's public agencies and the state legislature. The coalition says they are making it harder for the public to access information, and that is eroding the state's Public Records Act. Well, coming up, we're going to talk to Mike Fancher. And Matt, the big concern here is that it's transparency, and that the coalition is saying the state legislature in particular and state lawmakers really aren't being upfront in dealing with public records and making sure that the public has a right to get information that they should have access to, which doesn't help our democracy any.
No, yeah, when I worked for the city, the short time I did, open meetings, the Open Meeting Act was a big deal. I mean, everything you did as an official was recorded, and you couldn't erase it. Well, obviously there was some instances of erasers, but it's important for the public to be able to say, hey, I want to know what happened on that day because this affects X, or this affects me, or I need some information. So it should be easier for people, not harder.
Yeah, and we actually have a law in this state, a public records law that is supposed to give the public a right to access to what lawmakers are doing in the state legislature, what state public agencies are doing. And if you need information, one of the big problems here is that they delay and people spend months trying to get the information, which is not what the Public Records Act was all about. Fortunately, Governor Jay Inslee has stopped attempts by the legislature to try to override this act in any way. Well, here now is our conversation with Mike Fancher about the report and what the coalition would like to see done differently. Mike Fancher, thanks for joining us. We appreciate it.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Tell us why legislators seem to be so worried about giving up their info and just being transparent. What are they scared about?
It just seems to be something that's inherent in being a legislator, I guess. It's and it's not just legislators. A lot of public officials with really good intentions will say, but our work is so important that we can't let the public in to mess it up. We need to be able to talk candidly with each other, and we need to, have these free exchanges. And golly, we don't want the public watching that. It just seems somehow inherent. And in this particular legislature, they've been trying for years to exempt themselves from the Open Records Act. And they failed, I think it's about 3 years ago now, maybe less than that. And then they passed a bill, and the governor vetoed it after strong public protest. And so it's just been this gradual erosion of openness to records and somewhat to meetings.
Is it happening on both sides of the aisle?
Well, in this, there's a current dispute that we have with the legislature, and we've sued them. We lost in the first round, but because they're claiming something that they call legislative privilege, which would give them the individual right to exempt themselves from disclosure for certain information. And that seems to be coming mostly from the leadership, the Democratic leadership in the House. But the bigger picture here, and what the coalition tried to do was write a report on the status of the Washington Public Records Act And the larger conclusion that we've had is that there's been a long-term erosion to public access to government, and it's kind of reached a tipping point. And when we studied what's causing this, the very first thing we call out is the state legislature. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. When I worked for the city for a short time, the open records thing was a big deal. Everything you do that's that's part of your job is recorded, and people can call and say, look, hey, can I get your text from this day or this day and between these hours, and you have to give it to them. So why would the legislature feel they are exempt from that? Because anytime you have two legislators talking, that should be on the record, except if they're talking about, something that's personal.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just Washington State, but it's been about in the last 3 years or so that various state legislatures have asserted this notion of a legislative privilege. And I guess what's motivating that is because otherwise there's so much public pressure for access that they've seized on this idea that somehow the state constitution, a speech and debate clause in the state constitution, which protects them from being sued or charged for the crime for anything they say in their public function. Well, that's speech and debate. That's not records. That's not information that passes between legislators. So I don't know. I mean, it came out of nowhere, and they're standing pretty firmly behind it. And when you ask them, the typical legislator says, "Well, I've never used it myself." Well, that's because it didn't exist. It's not been a thing until recently. So I've never claimed it, and I have no intention to. Well, having no intention to doesn't mean you're not going to. So that's why we felt like the best course was to go to the court and try to get a ruling that there, in fact, is no constitutional exemption. But in the meantime, what we're asking legislators is take a pledge. Tell your voters, I pledge I will not claim legislative privilege. And it's been a handful that have been willing to do that. And the others say, well, let's wait and see what the courts say.
Well, there had to have been something at the very beginning, right, that prompted to enact the open records law.
Oh, absolutely. So this goes back in Washington State, this goes back to 1972. And this would be like the Nixon era. And there was a push for government reform. And in Washington State, a group called, interestingly, the Washington Coalition for Open Government launched a citizens initiative, which passed overwhelmingly. It's like a 70% favorable passage, calling for open public meetings, open public records, and openness in terms of campaign finance and things of that sort. So they passed a law, and over time, the openness began to erode. So in 2002, a group of journalists and lawyers who deal with First Amendment issues formed the new Washington Coalition for Open Government, and brought in citizen activists, and because we felt there was this erosion. Well, 20 years after that, more than 20 years after that, we feel there's really serious erosion, and there's a lot of pushback on the Public Records Act from local governments because they don't feel they feel it's burdensome, that it's too expensive, that it gets in the way of doing their job. And our attitude is, no, this is your job. This is what you're supposed to do, and you should fund it. You should treat it as any other public infrastructure, and the law says you should maintain records. You should organize those records, and unless there's an exemption, you should make those records available.
Why is this important?
Well, it's important because we have a democracy, because we have, there's a passage in the Open Records, in the introduction to the Open Records Act, that basically say the citizens of this state do not yield their sovereignty to the people that they've elected. It's not up to the elected officials to decide what it's good for us to know. We need to know that. We need to be able to hold you accountable for what you're doing. We need to be able to look over your shoulder, if you will, and know why you're doing what you're doing, how you're spending our money. And so, I mean, the history in Washington State has been very positive. The state government has been over the years, has been one of the leaders in the nation. And the erosion in recent years has been swift, and I think we think it needs to be reversed, and it needs to be reversed now. So we're calling the public to action. Read our report. It's available at our website, washcog.org, and there's a call to action in that report that citizens can use to connect with us, to follow us, to help their voice be heard. That's what we need right now.
You mentioned court case. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, we work in 4 areas. The Coalition for Open Government works in 4 areas: litigation, legislation, education, and recognition. So in litigation, when we feel it's necessary, we will challenge government. So, for example, when the State Redistricting Commission, a couple of years ago now, basically did its business in secret, we took them to court. We won a settlement, and they agreed to change their rules to increase training. So that's the kind of thing that we do. In this case, we went to court and we asked the court to declare that, in fact, there is no such thing as legislative privilege. And as I say, in Thurston County, at the first test, there have been 2 cases. The judges have ruled against our position, but we're going to persist until you take it to the state Supreme Court. And if ultimately there is declared to be some legislative privilege, personal privilege to communicate in secret, then I think a couple things have to happen. One is legislators and candidates have to pledge that they won't exercise that privilege. Governor Inslee said 3 years ago, because there is an executive privilege for the governorship, and he declared, I will not exercise that, and he has not. So we need a pledge from candidates and from legislators that they won't exercise this privilege should it be found to exist legally. And then what we need is lots of scrutiny on how that's being used, and we may need a change in either the state constitution or law to protect the public's interest here.
What was the court ruling against you? I mean, what was the position and what was the explanation?
It's a little unusual. Both of the judges who have heard this, one in response to our suit and another in response from a suit by a citizen, what the judges basically said was, in other in other states where there are similar Public Records Acts and similar language in the Constitution, the courts have found that there is a privilege. And so we're basically following that. But near as I could tell from what the judges were saying, that's only happened in Louisiana and Arizona. Washington State is not going to follow the leadership of Louisiana and Arizona in open government. Come on. We're Washington.
I hope so. I hope they won't.
That's not what our public expects.
Yeah. When I'm listening to this, and you want to engage citizens, of the state of Washington, it's pretty wonky stuff, and it's just kind of go over their heads. How do you simply explain the importance of this to people? Because, when you start getting down into the terminology and stuff, people just will blank out.
Yeah.
So how do you make it relevant to them in their everyday lives?
Well, sadly, it becomes relevant sometimes when they find out that they need access to something in their personal life and they can't get it. That's where most of our support comes from, is from people who feel like they've been burned.
Well, give us what's an example?
Public records don't belong to the government; they belong to the public. It's as simple as that sometimes. So that's the kind of thing that we try to reinforce with.
Because I hear stories all the time where people try to access documents or information, and it takes forever. I mean, is there a way, in what you guys are doing to speed access up? You know,
How many times you're an old newspaper guy?
Yes, I am an old newspaper guy. Yeah.
Well, I'm not going to say you're old. You're a veteran newspaper guy
there you go.
from the Seattle Times era. But I mean, journalists have to fight this all the time. And just trying to get basic information most of the time. And we get stonewalled. So to me, it's almost like, and in these times, when the divisiveness in the country and one guy running for president who, is really challenging our whole democracy, we better be worried about this stuff.
Yeah, we really do have to be worried, and that's why we go to court. That's why we're in the legislature. A good example of this is when the Public Records Act was originally passed, there were 10 exemptions where the law says in these 10 instances, the government can withhold records. Today, there are more than 600 exemptions. And that's where the public needs to recognize, and sometimes it's with really good intentions. Somebody will come in and say, we have to close off access to this kind of a record to protect people who are vulnerable, some good intentions. Typically, then they have a sweeping exemption that covers all kinds of bad behavior that comes to light later. And so, when you see these stories, a good example here in Seattle was during the CHOP, during the protests, and when the press sought records of communication among the mayor, the police chief, the fire chief, and other city officials, it turned out those records had disappeared. And when the families of people who were injured or killed in that time sought records and found out they couldn't get them, the court basically said, well, then you win your case. And the city had to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in settlements. And no one knows to this date, really, why the mayor's cell phone records were gone, the police chief's records were gone, the fire chief's records were gone. And this is...
I think someone knows.
Well, someone knows, but nobody paid a price for that.
Well, the taxpayers did.
The taxpayers definitely.
Yeah.
And that's one of the problems. It always falls on the taxpayers to bail government out.
Yeah, because they had to pay a settlement.
Oh, yeah, and a big settlement, and that's
buku bucks
with some smaller towns where they've messed up or withheld records or lost records, and they end up with big settlements that the taxpayers pay. So it's just time to call time out, figure out what's happening, help train people in government, and make sure that there's accountability within the law. Now, in the Seattle case, when records officers at the city of Seattle realized that these records were missing, they were told, don't tell anybody. And the two records officers who were involved ended up leaving their jobs, and then they sued the city.
Right, and they
public money went there. So I just think there needs to be a real conscience within the people who want to be in elected office to say, our job is to operate openly, transparently, and with accountability. And our job is to help the public scrutinize what we do. And there are lots of people who behave that way. And I have real admiration for people in public life. But the system is broken, and we need to address that systematic problem.
Looking back on this, was there one particular legislator that just totally objected, that kind of started the domino effect of like, no, we're not going to cooperate here?
You mean to have privacy or to have openness?
No, to have privacy, to not comply.
Well, I don't know that I'm in a position to
just between you and me, Mike.
Yeah. But the problem is that collectively they have accepted this notion that the way they're operating is good enough. I mean, back when they passed that bill to exempt themselves from the Public Records Act, and we objected and helped build a case against that. And 13 newspapers in this state on the same Monday morning had front page editorials calling on the governor to veto the bill. And ultimately, before he even got around to doing that, the legislature came to him and said, please save us from ourselves. Please veto this bill. But it keeps coming back around. And every session, there are more exemptions that are proposed. We have in our state what's called the Sunshine Committee. Its job is to recommend exemptions that can be sunsetted, can be written off. They don't even get hearings these days on their recommendations.
There's no sunshine in the Sunshine Committee, because didn't they have gone to the governor, some of the members, and said that were appointed by the governor, saying that, hey, we're toothless.
Yeah.
We have no purpose. So don't even, I want to resign.
Yeah. One of our board members was on the Sunshine Committee, and she resigned. And the attitude that was building up with frustration was nobody cares. Well, we think the people care, and that's why we decided to do this report. We felt that if we put out this report, that the public understood what's happening, that we would see a groundswell of reaction, and hopefully that's what's going to happen, and we'll see the public officials at all levels stepping up and saying, "Yeah, we need to fix this thing because the people do have a right to know."
Yeah, I think you need to use real examples too, and not just say read the report, because people won't read the report. And I think your idea of a pledge is important, because it's like people when they say, well, I pledge I won't take PAC money, or I won't do this, or I won't do that. I mean, I think, pushing people, political candidates and people that are in office to do that would go a long ways, because that's another way to hold them accountable. People may not even know what that means, but they certainly will know what it means if they violate that pledge.
Right. Another thing that we're seeing, not just in Washington State, but really throughout the country, is that as journalistic resources have eroded, there are fewer and fewer reporters covering state houses, and that the public officials aren't being scrutinized as much, and that's causing even more secrecy. So, trying to get people exercised about that and weighing in is I think really important.
Which is why we need local journalism, why we need to support it, which is because it's a part of our democracy.
Right.
And without it, our democracy is in trouble.
Well, I mentioned that one of our 4 core areas of activity is recognition, because we think it's really important that when somebody does the right thing, that gets called out and celebrated. So we have an annual awards. We have an annual awards breakfast in March coming up. It's already March, isn't it? Where we honor people who have done good works. One of our awards is called the Kenneth Bunting Award. Ken was a Intelligencer editor and publisher, and he went from the PI to head the National Freedom of Information Center. He's deceased now, but a wonderful, wonderful public servant. And we have this Ken Bunting Award that goes to news media for coverage in this area, and it's a really good recognition. And the entries get better every year. There are fewer and fewer reporters, but they're doing some wonderful work. Public media, private media, nonprofit media. It's really gratifying to see that, but it's an uphill battle. I like to say that we're winning a lot of battles. The public advocacy people, we're winning a lot of battles, but we're losing the war.
Yeah. So what is something that that's in the public space right now that's being reported on that involves public disclosure, that they may not even know about it?
Well, let me think of an example. There was I think it was a Politico story just this week about so in Washington State, and I don't have all the specifics, but where during that redistricting process, I think it was Republican legislators or advocates were working behind the scenes to try to essentially torque the system against the whole notion of it's not political, it shouldn't be partisan, and that's why we have a commission. But behind the scenes, people were gaming the system. Yakima was one of the places where there were lots of complaints about what the result was. So that would be an example, I think, of where the system isn't working and it needs to be fixed. Another case right now, I think that's what's problematic. The way we describe this is that a lot of public officials are using technology not to enhance openness and transparency, but in fact to increase secrecy, because they're using private email accounts and communications techniques, and that needs to be stopped. And we need to use this new technology to, in fact, make it easier for people to get the information that they're entitled to. In fact, we're in some conversation with people in Olympia to try to develop some new ways of applying technology. And good golly, in Seattle and Washington State, we got the best technologists in the world. We ought to be able to fix some of these problems. And I think a lot of officials would love that.
Yeah. So what can people look forward to? I mean, what can they see that will happen publicly that they can kind of recognize that this is what this is and how they need to get behind it?
Well, one of the things we're going to try to do is a public rollout campaign of this paper, so this report. So if a community group wants to come out and have us present it and talk about it, or if a community group is having problems, one of the things we like to do is go in and bring people together and try to solve problems before they end up in lawsuits. So you'll see more activity on that. We have operated on a shoestring for years. We got a very nice, significant grant last year from two longtime Seattleites, Jim and Birta Falconer, and that's given us a chance to, well, in fact, we couldn't have done this report without their donation and support. So I think you're going to see more and more public activity. The press, I think, really gets this, and you're seeing more and more coverage of this. And it's great to see. It's Crosscut, it's Seattle Times, it's KUOW, it's it's a broader range of
Chino Y Chicano.
Yeah. No, and thank you for having this conversation, because this is part of what we're trying to do, is enlist people in this effort. And I like to say that nothing is more important to the cause of open government than the activism of the public. And the way I put that is, when people speak resoundingly enough, politicians listen. They don't necessarily listen right at the start, but over time. And again, I think most people who are in public life are well-intentioned, and they want support, and they want to serve the public. So it's trying to identify what are the pain points, and that's what we did in this report. So we've got an overriding recommendation that says the public access to government information is eroding, and yet that trend needs to be reversed. And then we have some specific recommendations that we call out in terms of what's causing that problem. And then we have a host of recommendations for things that can be done. And we stand ready to try and work with people in government to do that. I think that's important too. We're not just here to be a scold.
Well, being a scold works sometimes. I mean,
I was talking to a longtime friend who's an old newspaper journalist in Oregon,
a veteran,
and he said he was talking about the erosion of openness because there are fewer and fewer reporters, and he said, "But I can stick a hot needle in their side from time to time." I thought, well, I'm not sure exactly what that is, but he'll do it. So but it really what we want is for the people to understand this is their cause. They need to, as I say, it's your time to be heard.
Well, Mike Fancher, OG, you're the OG,
OG,
OG, yeah. And we really appreciate all this information. I think this is vital because our democracy is challenged in every way. And if we don't make sure that, and I think, as old newspaper and broadcast journalist types, we have to continue to sound the alarm. So I appreciate what you guys are doing, and thank you for taking the time to share with us. And we'll keep touting this.
Well, thank you. I mean, Enrique, you and I have done this a lot over the years. Sunshine Week's coming up in mid-March, and a lot of years where we were on platforms together beating the drum. So thank you, Matt, too, for your support.
Our pleasure, and God knows we could use some sunshine right
Oh,
now.
my God.
All right, Mike Fancher, thank you very much.
Thank you. So long.
The Chino Y Chicano podcast is available on your favorite podcast provider.
You can watch the video version on YouTube, and Converge Media, a leading producer of culturally relevant content in the Pacific Northwest. We'll talk more later.